Welcome. Thank you for being here with me this evening. I'm going to share my screen now to my PowerPoint. And then get it going here. So let's see. There we go. Okay. As Jossie said, my name is Chris Theory, and I am the Map and GIS librarian here at the Colorado School of Mines. And I really want to thank you for attending tonight. I just want to let you know ahead of time in the chat, I put right at the beginning there all the links that I'm going to use in this talk. So you don't have to madly scribble them down. And we'll also do that at the very end. So again, you don't have to, if I go over something too quickly, you don't have to write everything down. The background that I'm using for my talk right now, where you can see me live, is actually the 1888 map of Golden, Colorado. Today's talk is part of GIS-Day. Geographic Information System, GIS, is a way of displaying data that has a geographic content. This will be a presentation about my research. Alas, it's not an open conversation. In the near future, I'd like to have one of those. But tonight, I'm just going to tell you about what I have found. But before I begin, I must recognize and thank the folks at the Mapping Prejudice Project at the University of Minnesota. Their work and presentations and guidance has inspired and helped me so much. In particular, I want to thank Kirsten Delgard, Brian Matke, and Kevin Erman Sulber. I also want to thank Rhonda Frazier, the Jefferson County archivist, who's been a tremendously helpful partner in this project. And lastly, I want to thank members of the Golden Anti-Racism Collective and Golden United, and in particular, Don Cameron, who have offered me encouragement, great suggestions, and background history. I also want to add at this time, I will quote historical documents, and they use terms like Negroes for African Americans and Mongolians for Asian Americans. And I do not use these terms to offend or shock. I'm quoting historical documents so that you will understand the words people used at the time the documents were created. So here's an outline of my talk. I'm going to talk about how I got into this subject and give you some background on the history of real estate in Jefferson County. I'm going to talk about the Mapping Prejudice project in Minneapolis, the plat maps that I found here in Jefferson County. I will show you the interactive map that I have made and some examples I found in the archives here in the county, and talk about the findings that I've come across. Lastly, I'll talk about some unanswered questions and what's next. In February, I attended a mapping conference at Stanford University. The keynote speaker was Ryan Matke, the Map and Geospatial Information Librarian at the University of Minnesota. He told us about the Mapping Prejudice project in Minneapolis. The project examines the history and legacy of racism in real estate developments and practices in the Minneapolis area. A major component of the research is the examination of property deeds and the identification of those that contain race-based exclusionary language. Starting in the 1910s through the 1950s, developers and owners inserted clauses like "for Caucasians only" into property deeds in the form of covenants. And these covenants had the force of law behind them. The covenants stipulated that if at any time, be it 1 year, 10 years, and regardless of the owner, whether you were the first owner or the fifth owner of a property, if the covenant was broken, that is, the property was sold to an African-American person, the property and all of its equity would revert to the original owners or their heirs. So think about that for a second. If you had one of those covenants on your property and you sold that property to an African-American, you would lose not only your property, but all the equity in that home. It really would give you pause before selling to an African-American person. Before learning about this project, I knew racism played a large role in the development of real estate, but I had no idea that it went all the way down to the level of property deeds. Upon returning from my conference, I met with Jefferson County Archivist Rhonda Frazier. I told her what I learned, and together we wondered if these racial restrictions happened in Jefferson County, Colorado. Sadly, the first map Rhonda pulled from the drawer had such language in the covenant. In Birmingham, Alabama, I would expect to find these covenants, but not in Jefferson County, Colorado. Sadly, then COVID hit, and I put this topic in the back of my mind. Then George Floyd was killed. And once again, America came face to face with the ugly and soul-crushing truth of systemic racism. I wondered, what can I, one middle-aged white guy, do to help? How can I make this a better country? How can I help right the wrongs of systemic racism? I was spurred on by one African-American commentator who said, I am tired of teaching white people about history. I thought, I have the background in history, maybe I can help by bringing some light onto the subject of systemic racism in real estate in Jefferson County, Colorado. Maybe I can help people overcome what Brian Mackey called a willful amnesia around this time. Forever and a day, people have been telling other people where they can and cannot live. The reasons are the usual suspects, race, religion, ethnicity, and even marital status. Starting in the late 1800s, but not catching on until the early 1900s, forms of discrimination in real estate ownership and occupancy in the United States became codified, written into legal documents. When people ask for examples of systemic racism, this is front and center. Laws and codes were put in place in the real estate system that allowed people with the full backing of local, state, and federal governments to discriminate on the basis of skin color. Cities across the US passed zoning ordinances that said who could live in what part of the city. This usually had to do with race, but sometimes had to do with religion or ethnicity. In part, these ordinances were passed in a response to the great migration of African Americans from the South to northern cities. Race-related zoning ordinances were struck down by the Supreme Court in 1917 in Buchanan versus Worley. So people tried different ways to keep their neighborhoods segregated. They inserted race-based exclusionary language into covenants. Covenants, usually titled restrictive covenants in real estate, are legally binding statements associated with an individual property. Today, many of us are familiar with covenants that limit what color you can paint your house. Starting in the 1910s, developers would include race-based language into covenants that covered entire subdivisions or neighborhoods. In 1926, in Corrigan versus Buckley, the US Supreme Court ruled that such clauses constituted a private action and not subject to the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. Thus, covenants were legal and could be backed by the law and law enforcement. The incidences of race-based exclusionary language exploded afterwards. However, on May 3rd, 1948, in Shelley versus Kramer, the Supreme Court struck down race-based covenants. These parts of the covenants became unenforceable by government agencies. Interestingly, 3 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court had to recuse themselves from this case because they owned property that had race-based covenants attached to it. The 1964 Civil Rights Act dealt with many inequities under the law, and the 1968 Fair Housing Act outlawed discrimination in real estate practices. But the problems of racism in real estate and housing still exist, and the legacy of its former legal practices are deep and impact the society to this day. In fact, those race-based covenants, while totally unenforceable, are still on official records, including subdivision plats and even some deeds. Redlining is a term that's been in the news the last few years. This is a map of Denver from 1938 showing how things were redlined or an outline. Starting in the Great Depression, lending agencies in cooperation with the federal and state governments created maps of large cities that categorize neighborhoods into grades, with the highest being A, or green, and D, red. You can see the green neighborhoods and the red neighborhoods here in Denver and everything in between. A, green, meant the area was full of quality housings and a safe place to make low interest loans with government-backed insurance. D, red, meant the exact opposite: low quality homes, a risky place to make loans, and no government-backed insurance. And the ratings applied not just to the houses, but the people that lived there. Green, low or good risk; red, a bad risk. The green A neighborhoods were almost exclusively inhabited by white people. And sadly and unsurprisingly, the red, outlined in red, thus redlining, neighborhoods were almost entirely inhabited by African Americans or other minorities. Couple redlining with race-based exclusionary language in neighborhood covenants, and the fact was most African Americans could not move to a different neighborhood. And even worse, they could not get a loan to buy a house even in a redlined area. This meant African Americans had a difficult time building equity and wealth with real estate, the most common way white Americans build wealth. Redlining and race-based covenants are merely parts of many interlocking pieces of systemic racism. I want to give a quick word about the Mapping Prejudice project in Minnesota. It's really incredible. It really is. They've gained access to scanned copies of the city and county housing deeds in the Minneapolis area, and they have optical character read OCR the deeds. Using over 1,000 volunteers, they have been identifying properties with race-based covenants. They've mapped those locations. They added tons of other information, including census data and personal stories. On their website, you can find presentations that they have done. They know much more and can speak in greater depth about many aspects of this subject. People have been using the project's information to teach about the past, understand the present, and plan for the future. Data from the project is now being used by policymakers to help inform their decisions. And using the Minneapolis project as an inspiration and template, places like Jefferson County, Colorado, Golden, Colorado, Richmond, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and Tucson, Arizona have begun their own Mapping Prejudice project. I've merely begun to investigate this topic. My work to date is just a beginning, a rough draft. The place I started with my research was the plats held by the Jefferson County Clerk and Recorder. Plats are maps of developments of new neighborhoods or new subdivisions. Plats are created for property owners by surveyors or engineers for the purpose of subdividing the land and selling it into lots. These plats were signed off by county officials, by the planning board, the county commissioners, and the clerk and recorder's office. Plats were filed and remain at the Jefferson County clerk and recorder's office. I searched the plats here in Jefferson County from the 1860s, when the county started, to 1950. When I started, I had no idea how many documents I would have to search. 100, 10,000? Nor did I know how much I would find. Would I find 3 items from a list of 10,000? Or would I find 95 from a list of 100? I examined approximately 1,000 documents and found about 200 plats with protective covenants or something similar. And sadly, 85% of those covenants or plats, of those 200 plats had race-based restrictions in their covenants. And starting in the mid-40s, almost all of them did. Despite the Supreme Court ruling them illegal in June 1948, it wasn't until February 1950 that the race-based language disappeared from real estate covenants in Jefferson County, Colorado. The plats tell many stories and have a lot of information. One of the tricky parts, and I haven't figured this out completely, is to know what is relevant and what is not. This is a great example of what an older plat. Goodhart Stoddard subdivision is on the northeast corner of Garrison and 32nd. The original map was drawn by hand by a surveyor or engineer. The plat shows the boundaries and property boundaries and new roads, and it also shows you the dimensions of the property. Most of the plats have the following: the clerk and recorder's filing number, and sometimes a book and page number, the title or legal description or geographic description, a dedication, and this usually tells you who the owners are and has their signatures, a notary acknowledgement, the protective covenants, and this is where you find that race-based language, the engineer's certificate, so this is the surveyor or engineer, and lastly, approvals by the Planning Commission, the Board of Commissioners, clerk and recorder, all with signatures and official seals. Now I'm going to show you what I've created by examining these plats. After downloading the scans of the plats, I identified the areas they covered and extracted some language and other facts. Using a geographic information system, GIS, this is GIS-Day, the whole reason it's happening tonight, I mapped the subdivisions and attached some ancillary information. And then I created a website. It's a real rough draft. It's a first attempt, and I know it needs help. So I'm gonna kind of unshare and then share again my different screen. So one moment. Okay, again, the link for this is in the chat, and we'll put it there at the end too, and there's links on our website. So this is a map that I created. I looked at all the neighborhoods and subdivisions, and I created little boxes to outline where those places were. And off to the right-hand side here, you'll see, and I have some text here explaining what you're looking at. In the upper left-hand corner, you can flip over to the legend, and you can change the base map and just do all sorts of fun things. So basically, any box here, any that is red, had some sort of race-based covenant, race-based language within their covenant. Anything that is green, they had restrictive covenants, but there was no mention of race in that. And then you'll find a few in yellow, and those, they kind of hinted at it. I couldn't really tell. It was tough. It was tough. Excuse me. You'll see there's some different colors there because sometimes the properties, the boundaries overlapped, and sometimes there were certain subdivisions were platted several times for reasons I'm not certain. Anyway, if you go in and out of the map, you'll see that there's not a lot for the county. For those unfamiliar, Jefferson County is actually quite large. Remember, I only examined things that were built up in subdivisions made from the about the late teens to the 1950s. So if your house or subdivision was made after that time period, it's not going to show up here. And that really happened all over the county. There's some down here by Pine and down along 285 and near Conifer, but I'm going to start up here near Evergreen. Evergreen, many of you are familiar with it, has a nice downtown area, but turns out the area immediately surrounding downtown was in fact owned by one family or one estate, the Mary Williams estate. And during World War I, the estate was broken up and subdivided into many, and broken up and subdivided so that you could build a lot of houses in the area. And those plats that were associated with the subdivisions were the first ones I found in Jefferson County, chronologically, the first ones that had the exclusionary clause in there that these may be only occupied by Caucasian families. And I just want to show you what happens if you mouse over things, you click on any of the polygons, you get a little pop-up. And the pop-up will have the name of the subdivision, the date that that subdivision's plat or map was registered in the county office, what did it say in the race-related the race-related text. This time it says white householders, who the property owners were, who the surveyor was. And I put in, this is blank here, but every now and then I could find the mortgagee, that is the company or the individual that put the money up for the development. And lastly, the Jefferson County clerk and recorder and index number, so if you need to go find this thing. So Evergreen was one of the first places that was developed that had this language. Indian Hills, which is right here, also was developed at the same time in the 20s and had that language inserted into the covenants. Then as we pull back a little, just to show you the coverage of the rest of the county, for those of you familiar with the county, really it centers in on what is now Lakewood and parts of Wheat Ridge. And really from Alameda up to about 40th, that's where you're gonna find the most of the development that happened from the 20s through 1950. In Golden, where I live, there's only one development within the city limits and a few just outside the city limits. There's not a lot up here in Arvada. The county line is this dashed line right there. That's why this down dead. Again, we're going to put the link in the chat so you can go back and look at this later. I'm going to stop this. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint presentation. If this website is free for anybody to use and look around. And like I said, it is a first draft. It's not the best right at the moment. It can look a lot better. It's one of the things I need help with. All right, let me get out of this and go back to my PowerPoint. Stop sharing, and then I'm going to share my screen. 87 participants right now. And then present from this slide. Okay, we're back to it. All right. So some subdivisions were small. The Wilmot subdivision, which is on the Wilmore subdivision, which is on the left-hand side of the screen from 1947, has only 5 lots, while the West Alameda Heights subdivision, which is the map on the right, has 304 lots. Complicating my research was the fact that the names of the roads changed. For example, Kipling, which most of us are familiar with in this area, used to be called Howell. And neighborhoods could have some confusing names too. I found a subdivision, one subdivision called Beverly Heights, and I live in Beverly Heights in Golden, but this was a different Beverly Heights that's located in Lakewood. I want you always to remember that the things I'm showing you were legal documents backed by the power of the government, signed by government officials. On the plats that with the language, or race-based language, I usually found 2 versions of the plats. One was inclusionary, the other was exclusionary. The statements always used the same phrases. Here's an example of the inclusionary. And by inclusionary, I mean who was allowed to live there. And this is from the Glenda subdivision in 1946. And it says right here at the top, no persons of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. This covenant shall not, however, prevent use or occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with or at the employment of a white owner or tenant. And then there was exclusionary race. It was who could not live there. And the second example is from North Lakewood Heights subdivision in 1939. No tract shall at any time be occupied or owned by any person or persons of Mongolian or Negro races. However, this shall not prohibit the employment of persons of such races on the premises by the occupant. These clauses were struck down as unenforceable in 1948. However, to this day, they remain on the documents held by the county. In order to make clear that the race-based statements are illegal, all documents with those race-based language have the following stamp. Restrictive or protective covenants which contain any the specification limiting the transfer, rental, or lease of any housing because of race, creed, religion, color, sex, marital status, national origin or ancestry, or handicap, or other like classifications may be prohibited by state and federal laws. Other races and religions were often singled out in restrictions. In the 5th subdivision of Indian Hills, that's the kind of yellowish thing at the top, and I'm sorry that's a bad scan, but it was a bad print, and that's about the best we can do. In the main restriction part, the owners allowed Indians as well as Caucasians to own or occupy the properties. And this is me being very sarcastic right now by saying it was nice of the Ollinger Company to allow Indians into Indian Hills. But if you read in the next one, in the next paragraph down in number 1, it says that the occupants can only be Caucasian. So I don't know which statement was correct. The 1939's Upland Acres subdivision, which is the thing at the bottom, says that members of both the Mongolian and Negro races may not live there. Mongolian was a catch-all term used to describe Asian Americans. On other documents, you will see the term white instead of Caucasian. But how is that defined? Is it only people from Northern and Western Europe? Did religion have anything to do with being white? At the time, could you be Jewish and white at the same time? I don't know, because I don't know what their definition was to be white. In various parts of the country, people were excluded for national origin, such as being from the former Ottoman Empire. In Fresno, California, that meant no Armenians allowed. In other parts of the country, it meant other things. I do not know the motivations of the people at the time. Were they aware and conscious of the race-based exclusionary language, or were they just mindlessly copying things out of a book? Why can I find some subdivisions without these clauses and some with? In this 1945 map of Kincaid Springs subdivision, the statement regarding race was added later and is in a different handwriting. Clearly, this was a conscious choice by the map maker or the person filing this map. So here's some things that I learned so far. These offensive statements still exist in the documents today. They are unlawful and invalid, but they sit as reminders of our past. Jefferson County remained very rural until the explosive development of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. In 1950, the population was 55,000, about 1/10 of what it is today. The number of African Americans living in the county remained very small, only about 0.4%. But that data may be incorrect. The 1920 through 1950 censuses only categorized people as being white or non-white. And I do not know what the definition of non-white was in 1950, much less 1920. However, the 1930 census did have a category of Negroes, and 64 lived in Jefferson County in 1930, while the entire population of the county at the time was 21,000. The information I have found so far has been on the plats, and if you contrast this with the project in Minneapolis, their information was found on deeds. And also in Minneapolis, their covenants were more reactionary, a reaction to the Great Migration of Southern African Americans from the South into the northern cities in the early part of the 1900s. In Jefferson County, the covenants seemed to be more preventative. The African American population was not large in Colorado nor Jefferson County. Certain white people sought to keep it that way. The race-based covenants in our county seem to have some forward thinking behind them. And this could only happen if developers and county planners were involved. Individual property holders rarely think or can even act in such a grand scale and over such a long timeline. The plats that I examined were signed by elected and appointed officials. Those officials represented the will of the people. Behind these documents was the power of law and policing. I don't know how these past policies affected the county, nor do I know how my data can help with future policies. But it's important for all of us to know that the race-based exclusionary clauses in real estate did exist in Jefferson County, Colorado, and those clauses were legally binding at the time they were made. I like to tell people I have dozens and dozens of questions about this topic and how it relates to Jefferson County, but I will not bore you with those tonight. Instead, I will tell you about some of the gaps in my research. Most importantly, I do not have any human stories about racism in housing and real estate in Jefferson County. I've been unable to find census data for anything other than the county as a whole. I can tell you what the population of the county was in 1920, but not what the population was of Golden or Arvada or any of the other towns. My attempts to find information about the history of race relations in Jeffco have yielded little. I've yet to evaluate any of the individual deeds to see if those deeds actually include the race-based language too. I'm totally unfamiliar with the laws, history of laws, codes, statutes, etc. in real estate. I've not examined newspapers and city directories for housing announcements or advertisements. And lastly, I've yet to talk to and examine many city government and historical society records. So what are the next steps? Obviously, it's important to fill in the gaps in knowledge. We have to learn how these dry facts affected individuals and families. We must examine more records to tell a more complete story. We must work with and reach out to other groups and organizations. There's a great deal of interest in this topic. I've spoken with several people in the Denver region who have also begun looking at systemic racism in housing and real estate in Denver and in surrounding counties. So I think it might be a good chance to coordinate our efforts to put together something really large and interesting. Lastly, we must learn how to link the data and these stories with educators, policymakers, and the general public. For those really interested in this topic, and wanting to learn more, I have a list of resources and readings on my website. Again, we'll have the links here in the chat. That list is kind of small right now, but I plan to add to it. I highly recommend an 8-minute YouTube video entitled "The Segregation Myth, Richard Rothstein's Debunks the American Lie." And on the funnier yet really informative side, there's a 6-minute YouTube video from the series "Adam Ruins Everything," and it's titled "The Disturbing History of the Suburb." And as a complete total aside here, since I have a large audience, I just want to make a shameless plug for an aerial photograph tutorial that I've made. If you are interested in aerial photographs, I have made this awesome tutorial online. You can find it through our website. It's great. You will learn a lot. There's lots of fun quizzes, and I do mean they're fun quizzes. Please check it out. And I'm sorry for the shameless plug. I just want to do that. So wrapping up this slide. So how can you help? On my website, I have 3 forms that you can enter information. You can put in a personal story, and you can help us find more complete and compelling stories about the history of Jefferson County real estate. You can become, as my friend Diane said, a story hunter. I welcome suggestions and seek collaborations with groups or other organizations. One of my goals with this project is to document and shed light on our past. Sadly, systemic racism was not limited to one part of the country. These covenants with race-based exclusionary language existed and were enacted here in Jefferson County. Another of my goals is to inform everyone so we no longer remain naive nor willfully ignorant of how our county came to be in its present form. My fondest hope is that the knowledge generated from this project can be used to make this a more perfect union with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. at this time, so that's my presentation. At this time, stop sharing. Jossie is going to hope you've got some questions and that I can work on some of the questions. Or maybe.
Okay. So
what have you got for me, Jossie?
So I put them in the chat to you, but I can read them aloud as well too. Let me scroll up to the first one. So the first question was, did you scan all the plat maps when you were thinking about adding them to your ARC GIS online project?
Right. So the plats, working with the county archivist, Rhonda Frazier, I was able to acquire copies of the approximately 200 plat maps that I examined. And so I have those files. I converted them from PDF to JPEGs. I have the files, but they are not mounted anywhere. In speaking with the clerk at Jeffco Clerk and Recorder's Office, I asked them directly, can I put these online without any issues? They were like, nope, they're free and clear, copyright free. We can put them up somewhere. So it's a question of finding the space and organizing them. As the librarians in the audience will let you know, scanning something is about 1/10 of what you need to do to put it online. You need to add a lot of metadata and things like that. So that is a function of the project that has not been done. Yes. So. Next question, please.
We have another question. Do you know the proportion of the pre-1950s deeds you examined?
Of deeds, I have not looked at any of the deeds. I only looked at the plat maps for that were of the new subdivisions. So one of the next steps to do would be to examine the deeds. I would start probably with those specific subdivisions that we know have the exclusionary language in it, and see if some of the deeds within that subdivision actually had language in there too, like in Minneapolis, or was that language only on the plats and never translated down to the deeds? I do not know the answer to that. It's one of the next steps.
We had another question. Can these historical restrictions still be seen in present day demographics? Did they have enduring demographic impact?
That is a fantastic question, and that is one of the things that I strive and everyone helps to find out. We are lacking at the moment. It will take a lot of analysis and a lot of data to put that through, to find, to give you an idea of some of the data points that we will need to look at would be, we find all these things. Well, let's start looking at the deeds to find out if there were individual instances all throughout the county, and have to map those out. You'd have to overlay information about the various census. I do not, like I said, the census information from 1920 and 1950 had Jefferson County as one data point. So you couldn't break it down and say, okay, we know who lived up in Evergreen. We know who lived in Arvada. No, it just has one data point. So we have to break those census data down to understand where people lived. Did African Americans, were they clustered in a certain place, or were they dispersed throughout the county? I do not know. And then we'd have to look at housing patterns, housing ownership patterns with census data and with personal stories to see, in most places in the country, they found there's a continuum, a through line where those things that were put in place in, 70, 100 years ago influence what's going on today. It's a complete guess, but I would think that's true in Jefferson County. To what extent, I don't know. To what level? We have to find the data to answer that question better.
Next question, Chris, is have you overlapped this with current high needs neighborhoods to see if there might be any correlation?
Not at all. Nope. That's another data point that we need to look at for sure.
Okay. Chris, have you read Mapping Decline About White Flight and Black Flight in St. Louis? It's a great read about historical racism in St. Louis by Colin Gordon using census data.
No, I haven't. I was unaware of that book. I have read The Color of Law, which is I have that listed in my resources. That was a fantastic, interesting, and thoroughly depressing book about the history of racism and real estate development, and how just a lot of stuff you kind of knew deep down, yeah, that probably happened, but he documents everything so well. And this is the, hold on one second. The guy, the Richard Rothstein, that's the fella's name who wrote that book. And he's really, it's a really compelling read and has some incredible information. It's just a starting point. He's talking about the entire US and uses certain examples in that book. Highly recommend it. Yeah.
So we had another question that said, you said you reviewed 1,000 plats. Are there any additional ones that need to be reviewed?
Absolutely. I am confident that I did not. I like to think I'm good at reading things and picking up the information. I am confident I missed a few. I am confident that the clerk and recorder's office has those plats, which are usually large pieces of paper that, anywhere from 2 feet by 3 feet to much larger. And it's possible they had official, what they call books, that where things were registered, that there could be within those books other information. And it could be that maps have been lost through the years. I do not know. Also, it's possible, although most property information is held by the county, it could be that some of the local towns, Morrison, Golden, et cetera, have some information within their county, within their city archives. Probably not, but could be.
Awesome. And then we had another question too, again, about what's the proportion of plats that you did examine, and are there still more out there to be discovered?
Right, yeah, so I looked at, like I said, I looked at about 1,000 from the beginning of time in Jefferson County to, I found it February 1950, I'm looking at them, January 1950, it's got the language, just almost every single one, and then February 1950 disappears completely, and I started going through and I'm like, February, and I reached March, they were gone completely because of that Supreme Court case. Now, could it be that you go and look at things later in the 50s and you would still find it in several places? Could be. They were unenforceable, but somebody might have put that in, hoping it was enforceable, or they were mindlessly copying something.
Cool. I think that's all we have for the time being. If anybody has any other questions, comments, please put them in the chat right now. And yeah, Chris can go ahead and get that answered for you to the best.
Right. And Jossie, did you copy and paste those links?
Yeah. So I've done it a couple times throughout it, but I'll do it one more time for everybody.
Okay.
All the links.
And we'll leave this up. We're not gonna kill this room immediately. So that you have a chance. There's actually a way, I think, yeah, if you click on the 3 dots in the chat area at the bottom, it's something, you can save the chat, you can export it as kind of a text document or something like that. I've never actually done it, but people told me that works. Again,
we'll be sending out a follow-up email too, and I can include all of the links. And I mean, there's a lot of great resources that other people added within the chat. So I can make sure to save those as well and send those out in the email tomorrow.
Right, yeah. I see one question. The YouTube links are actually on my website. I have some tabs across the top. One is, information about the project, how to get involved. And one of them is readings and resources. And I have the links to the web pages there, or to the YouTube videos there.
I can't seem to be able to send my question to the chat room.
Yes, Dennis.
Can I ask it verbally?
Sure.
In the 20s, the Klan was very active in Jefferson County. And as a matter of fact, St. Anne's Church, which is one of the big Catholic churches for Arvada, the pastor had stairs built to keep the Klan from riding their horses into the church when they would come and have their big cross burnings. And one of the biggest cross burning rallies was up there when, in the mid-20s, St. Anne's was being built. Did you find any covenants against lesser desirable Anglo types like Catholics who might have been suspect because they swore allegiance to a foreign emperor, the Pope.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for the question, Dennis. No, I did not. The only things that I saw mentioned, so you would have Caucasian and white, and then you would have Negro and Mongolian. I never saw anything else. However, I will tell you, when I looked at the covenant, when I looked at the plats, they would have the list of the covenants. And so they'd either be numbered or lettered. And I would immediately look there. Once I found a few, I knew what I was looking for and I would go immediately there. But I was able to, because of that, I blew past, and sometimes it'd be text at the top. For example, I showed you that Indian Hills example where it says Indians are allowed to live in Indian Hills. Well, that wasn't in the numbering that 1 through 15 or whatever. That was in the kind of preamble of the covenant. So there could be some language in some of those preambles that I missed.
Yeah. Denver was.
And you're right that the influence of the Klan in Colorado was extensive.
Oh,
and
heavy, very heavy.
And had lasting legacies within the government agency. How that all relates to this topic, I do not know.
Yeah, and Denver was full of covenants. You couldn't sell to Jewish people over in Hilltop, and all of Bear Valley was all Anglo-Saxons. And so it's a great topic. I enjoyed it immensely, and thanks for letting me slip my question in.
You're welcome, Dennis. Yes, one of the, in talking to several people I know here from Denver, and I think Denver is a target-rich area for this topic. That Denver was built out extensively starting after World War I through 1950s, where my cutoff was because the language disappeared. But Denver was built out extensively during that time, and I suspect if people were to examine the covenants and deeds in the plats and the deeds in Denver, that there'd be a lot of information to be found.
Cool. I think that's all the questions we have right now. Chris, we did have a question about where to find the aerial photography tutorial, but we were able to get that link.
Yes, thank you to Carol, my boss.
Yes.
Who looks like she's in some sort of haunted barn right now. I don't know what it is. Oh, there you go.
That's my living room.
Oh, okay, sorry. It just looks spooky the first time. It's like you were outside on a porch. Okay, so the picture from my backdrop, somebody asked about that. This is, again, Golden, 1888. It is called a bird's eye view. And I know Mark Dodge from Golden History would like me to point out that the city just bought a copy of this map, and it's going to go on display at the History Museum downtown sometime soon. I don't know when. Anyway, the Library of Congress, they were one of the first organizations to start scanning historic maps and putting them online. If you go to the Library of Congress, in their scans, they have this whole category of maps, and within maps, they have maps of cities. And you can find, they scanned all these bird's eye views from the 1800s, and there were hundreds of them. Of Colorado, I think there's only a couple dozen. Golden, they just did the one. Denver, several. And some of them are this beautiful background, beautiful things. You can download those, you can print them, you can make them into t-shirts. They're all copyright free. You can do what you like there. Another place, if you don't know, is davidrumsey.com. Find things like that. So that's all I've got, folks. Thank you so much for coming. I'm so happy to see all of you. Please, if there's something I can help you out with, map or GIS wise, or you would like to talk further about this topic or other topics, or interested in that air photo tutorial, please contact me. We will, as Jossie said, we will be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow that will have my contact information and also a link out to the website and where you can find more information. And we will have this recording up hopefully in about a week or so.
One last thing. So we'll, with the follow-up email, we'll have a quick little survey. And if you are interested in adding your name to an email list where we can send you more information about events, whether it be kind of around this topic or just kind of things that are going on in the library, we'd love to have you sign up for that as well. So we won't be using anyone's email address to spam them. It's an opt-in only thing. So thank you again, everybody.
Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
That was awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Awesome job. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Super interesting.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hi, Jackie.
Hi,
Jackie.
Dennis. Hi,
Jackie
Chris.
Lee Conley.
Hi, Jackie.
Hi. Hi. Hey, Chris, did you find anything about VA loans? Because I know Jefferson County, when they had their big building boom, and African Americans were heavily, it was really, the VA loans were, they made it almost virtually impossible for them to
Right.
get them. And so I was just
not
wondering
looked at
if
that.
that was part of the disparity that we see after the 1950s is because of the lack of access to those
Oh, it's
VA
one
loans.
it's one of the many reasons. There's so many reasons. And yeah, no, I haven't looked that deeply into things. I think there's so much information and it all kind of, it fits together into, there's so many things that fit together and influence it. Yeah, and you know, why did some of these neighborhoods, when they were platted, not have that information? Why they did not have those race-based covenants? I don't know. You know, what that's one of the things to look at the demographics too, to say, well, they couldn't make it race because the people who were living there when they were developing were already, African Americans were already living there. You know, I don't know. It's interesting.
And I was wondering about the ramifications for people who wanted to rent to a person of color.
Well, according to they, you know, if it had that clause in there, the way I've read it, and I am not a lawyer, so the way I read it is that you couldn't. Your neighbors would go, hey man, says right there, you can't do that in this neighborhood.
I'm sure
And
you're right.
we are going to sue you, and we are going to call the cops, and the cops can look at this piece of paper and enforce the law.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the things that we're missing here is personal stories, right? We all know of stories in every major city in the United States of where an African American family tries to move into an all-white neighborhood, and sometimes it ends very tragically. You know, mobs show up in front of these people's houses, and it's just horrific.
Yeah.
I don't know if that happened in Denver, if that happened in Jefferson County. Were there any incidences like that?
It did happen in Denver when there was a postman, an African-American mail deliverer, tried to move east of Josephine. They burned the house down. That was in the mid-20s. But the most interesting little neighborhood that I had the pleasure of representing was Globeville. In Globeville, there were so many different little ethnic groups. You had the Croatians, the Russians, the Serbians, the Slovenians, and all those different little, they only allowed one Irish family in, the Sullivans, whom I knew. But it was all very there was nothing written down. As soon as a house became available on the Germans from Russia block, they would find another Germans from Russia to move in and buy it. I mean, it's just a fascinating little balkanization of the neighborhood, which there's nobody hardly left. There's only about 5 or 6 families of Slavic extraction and German from Russia extraction over there. But it was just fascinating to hear the early residents talk when I first represented Globeville. So again, a joy to be with you tonight, and I so enjoyed it. It was a great enlightenment, and it shows you how horrible human beings can be to each other, even on the basis of where you live. So
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah, I think that you're gonna, if the more times you're able to do this program, you're gonna get stories.
Yeah.
You're gonna find people interested. I, for one, would like to have you come speak. I teach race classes on racism for Ollie. Are you familiar with that?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, and so I'm doing an 8-week class in the winter. So I'm going to contact you and see if you'd be willing to come on Zoom and do this.
that would be
Absolutely.
great.
I would love to do that.
That would be just great. It's going to be on Thursday afternoons, so you can pick your Thursday afternoon, and I think you'll get people who are going to say, "Oh, gee, I want to get into this." And
I hope so. I think one of the, one of the things I hope that people will really be interested in, that we can work together as a group and put, one of the hard part is getting all these disparate data points and kind of putting them together so that it tells a story and that you understand, so we have a better understanding. We can put some faces, some humans behind these stories and not just go, there were 37 people here and there are 72 people there and things like that. So.
Yeah, well, there are plenty of nerds who love doing this research. So
yeah, I'm looking at a few of them right now. So I think.
Right, you're right. But good for you. I'm so glad that you started this.
Yeah, well, like I said, the folks in Minneapolis they totally inspired me. They got the idea. There have been people working on this subject for a long time, and it's clearly this work should have been done and known about for long ago, but we've got to start somewhere.
You bet. Good for you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mm.